So first of all, let me just say how honored I am to be here and how much I appreciate the invitation and all the work that went into the program. Thank you, Mayor, for that very generous introduction. And thank you to the library staff who did all the work for putting this together. So I'm going to talk for a little bit because, as the Mayor said, I'm an academic. It's just... And then I would be more than happy to answer any questions, to discuss anything you'd like to bring up. As Mayor said, I teach American history. And particularly, I teach a course that I love to teach that really is really important to me on the American Civil Rights Movement. And one of the things that happens when you teach a course on the American Civil Rights Movement is you have students come in and they know the history of the Civil Rights Movement. Americans know the history of the Civil Rights Movement. Or maybe a better way of putting it is they know a history of the Civil Rights Movement. And if you ask most Americans when the Civil Rights Movement began in the United States, what they're going to tell you is that it started on a Thursday night. December 1st, 1955, when Mrs. Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a bus in Montgomery, Alabama. And what they're going to tell you is that by that single act of defiance, what happened is that she triggered a social movement that raced across the South of the 1950s and 1960s. It marched into the hallways of Little Rock Central High School in September of 1957. It sat down at the lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina in February of 1960. It rode the bus out of Anniston, Alabama in the spring of 1961. It raged across the campus of the University of Mississippi in September of 1962. It filled the streets of Birmingham, Alabama with children in the spring of 1963. It marched across the Edmund Pettus Bridge outside of Selma, Alabama in March of 1965. And it died on a motel balcony in Memphis, Tennessee on the 4th of April of 1968. That's the story of civil rights in the United States as most Americans know it. It is a sacred story in the United States. And there's a lot of reasons for that. There's a lot of reasons that's become a sacred story, but I think one is particularly important. Because you got to stop for a second and think about what that story is, what that story says. What it says is that white Americans, and particularly white Southerners, embraced the sin of racism. It says that African Americans walked into the face of that sin. That they took that sin on their shoulders. That they suffered for that sin. That they died for that sin. And by that blood sacrifice, they redeemed the soul of the nation. That the standard story of civil rights in the United States, as Americans understand it, is, in other words, the Christian story of redemption, fused onto the American creed. And when I set out to write Arc of Justice, really, I had kind of one simple question in mind. What happens to the story of civil rights if you step outside the South of the 1950s and 60s? What if you looked at a civil rights story that didn't take place in the South, didn't take place in the 1950s and 60s? What happens to the story of civil rights then? Does it become less redemptive? So, let me tell you a story. And it centers, of course, on one night, really one bit of a night, of absolute terror. September 9th, 1925, at this house on the east side of Detroit. Now, That should not have been a night of terror. The day before, on September 8th of 1925, as I know some of you in this room might know, a young couple by the name of Ocean and Gladys Sweet moved into that house on the corner of Garland Avenue and Charlevoix. Is anybody an East Sider? What are you doing out here? I'm an East Sider. Never mind. I won't go there. I was going to make some joke about but never mind. It's probably not a good idea. The previous day, on September 8th, 1925, Ocean and Gladys Sweet moved into this house, their first house they ever owned. You guys are the right crowd for this. Remember the first house you ever owned? Remember what a big deal that was? Remember how exciting that was? That's not the second one, not the third one, not whatever. The first one, that's really exciting, right? Because you are kind of literally and figuratively crossing a threshold in your life. And that's what it would have been and should have been for the Sweets too, except for one fact. That's not it. The Sweets were African American, and the neighborhood was completely white. And Dr. Sweet in particular, as most of you know, he was a medical doctor. He understood that by that single act of defiance that he was running the risk of facing the wrath of his new neighbors. He understood that they could well try to physically drive him out of that house. And there was nothing more terrifying than that. Just a little bit of background. Ocean Sweet was born in Orlando, Florida, actually in 1895. He grew up not in Orlando, but in a little town called Bartow. Another question for you. I love coming back to Michigan, man. Any of you Tigers fans? Like, no one's going to raise their hand. No. He finished under 500. No way. But I was in 84. That was an insider joke, man. This is so much fun. Well, the reason I ask is that the Tigers' spring training is in Lakeland, Florida, right? Bartow is the next town straight south of Lakeland, sitting in the center of the state. Now, the two things that matter here are the date and the place. He was born in 1895 and he grew up in Florida, which means that he grew up in the Deep South at exactly the moment that the racial segregation of the Deep South, the system we call Jim Crow, was consolidating. And as you may know, that was a process that was driven by the most fierce level of white violence. Bartow is an ordinary town. I've been to Bartow. Bartow is an ordinary town. There's nothing special about Bartow. But 5 times when Ocean Sweet was growing up in that town, white people lynched black men in Bartow. And in the worst of those incidents, when he was 5 years old, the good people of Bartow burned at the stake a 16-year-old young man. Which is to say that Ocean Sweet knew exactly what a white mob could do. Now, the Sweet family were ordinary people. Ocean Sweet's grandparents had been born into slavery. Ocean Sweet's parents were small-time farmers. They owned a 1/4 acre of land on the black side of town. Now, as if I haven't said this already, I am a city person. But even I know a 1/4 acre of land is not a big farm. They were small-time people, small-time operators, ordinary people. But there was one thing that's really important to understand about them, and when I started working on the book, I didn't know this. They were devout members of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, which is to say that they believed in what we call the American dream. You work hard. They worked hard. You live a good life. You avoid sin. You get an education. And if you do all of those things, you can rise as far as your skill and hard work will take you. That's what Ocean Sweet's parents believed. It's what they taught their kids, and their kids, Ocean was the oldest to survive into adulthood, were very good kids. They learned their lesson. But Ocean Sweet's parents were also not stupid people. They understood that none of this was true in the Jim Crow South, not for African Americans. You could go through 8th grade if you were an African American in the Bartow public school system, and after that you couldn't go any farther. There was a nice new high school in Bartow. It was only for white kids. Black kids get through the 8th grade, that's it, you're done. And that was not good enough for the Sweets. So when he turned 13, they sent him off to Ohio. They put him on the train and they sent him to Ohio, to a little college in southwest Ohio, Wilberforce University. You Wilberforce? Oh, perfect. Well, you and I will just talk in the heck with everybody else. Now, in those days, Wilberforce is one of the great colleges in the historically black college system. Those days, Wilberforce had a high school academy attached to it.
I think that's where my husband's grandfather went, to that Wilberforce Academy.
This is so cool. Oh, absolutely. Have you been down there? Down in Xenia?
Yes.
Oh, you got to find out if that, yeah, you got to find. This is so cool. I was doing the Detroit thing, and now it turns out it's a Wilberforce connection instead. This is so cool. The reason they had the high school academy was because there were lots of really bright African-American kids in the South who weren't going to get a high school education, and this was a way to provide at least some of them that opportunity. And so 13 years old, he got in the train, came all the way up to Ohio to get his high school diploma. And he did. That was not good enough for the Sweets. So he stayed at Wilberforce, and in 1917, he got his BS in chemistry, which is an extraordinary accomplishment. Vast majority of Americans in 1917, black, white, they were not getting college degrees. He did. But that was not good enough for the Sweets. And so in 1917, with his undergrad degree in hand, he went off to Howard University's medical school in Washington, D.C. No.
My son went to
This is all right, can I tell you a story? Went to U of M? I will say, I went to U of M for grad school. I just really want to say, what my real commitment is to my undergrad, which is the University of Detroit. And I am so old, yes, it was the University of Detroit back then, not U of D, Mercy. But I got to tell you a story. This is a story inside a story. So I don't know if any of you have ever been to Howard. Howard is a gorgeous campus in Washington. It sits up on a hill in Washington, D.C. So when I was writing the book, I called it the jewel in the crown of the black college system, which I thought, that sounds good. And then I gave a talk in Atlanta. Yeah. So let me just say, it's one of the jewels in the crown in the black college system. So he went to Howard University's medical school, and in 1921, he graduated with his MD. That is the American dream. 2 generations from slavery to the highest of professional standards. 1 generation, small-time farmers, to the highest of professional standards. That is an extraordinary accomplishment. Or it would have been. Now, I know that in 1921, there were no black doctors in Bartow. So he could have gone back home. Man, can you imagine that? Go back home, provide your community with a fundamental service, live near your parents get to say all the time, my son, the doctor. But Dr. Sweet was an ambitious man. And Bartow's a small town. And my guess is he certainly didn't want to go back to the Jim Crow South. And so instead what he did in 1921 with his MD now, is he moved to the fastest growing, most vibrant city in the Western world, Detroit. Here's the way you got to think about Detroit in 1921. Detroit in 1921 was Silicon Valley. It was the center of the most important, the fastest growing, the most dynamic industry in the world. And it was centered in Detroit. Detroit was a boom town of massive proportions. In 1900, Detroit was the 15th largest city in America. Does anybody know what is today the 15th largest city in America? Exactly. It's Columbus, Ohio. Exactly. I lived in Columbus, Ohio for 11 years. I love Columbus, Ohio. My kids grew up in Columbus. I feel very fondly of it. But we did move. Are any of you from Columbus? Whew. Oh, really? Now I feel bad. Don't tell anyone I said that. I have a lot of friends still in Columbus. That was a joke. Columbus is a terrific city, but you don't think of it as a major metropolitan area, right? That's what it means to be the 15th largest city in America. By 1920, Detroit was the 4th largest city in America, and everyone assumed it was quickly going to become the 3rd, pass up Philadelphia. It was a magnet for people from around the world. Immigrants from Eastern Europe poured into Detroit. Immigrants from Southern Europe poured into Detroit. Immigrants from the British, from Britain, from Scotland, from Ireland. I almost called it the British Isles, and in my family you get in big trouble calling it the British Isles. So I'm really glad I stopped just in time. Not that any of you are in my family, so I don't know why I have to worry about that. Just massive waves from the Middle East, massive waves of immigrants coming into the city of Detroit. Well over half the adults living in the city of Detroit in the 1920s were immigrants or the sons or daughters of immigrants. Well over half the city. It was also a major site for the migration of African Americans out of the Jim Crow South and up to the north. 1900, Detroit's black population was 5,700 people. It's nothing. More African Americans around Bartow than that. By the early 1920s, it was 85,000 people. So the way you got to think about Detroit is a place just jammed full of people. And they're competing for jobs, and they're competing for places to stay, and they're competing for this, and they're competing for that. As it grew, it also became a deeply divided place. In the early 1920s, Detroit was a major center of Ku Klux Klan activity. There were 30,000 official Klansmen living in the city of Detroit by 1923. 30,000, that's official Klansmen. They're the people who literally spent the $10 and got the official sheet. You can't just take a sheet off your bed. You got to buy the official sheet. 30,000 people did that. So you can just guess how many people there were who believed in what the Klan preached, but were too cheap to buy the sheet. Now, the Klan was anti-black. That kind of goes without saying. It was also deeply anti-Semitic. It was profoundly anti-Catholic. That was actually its biggest appeal in Detroit, was its anti-Catholicism. Tried twice in the early 1920s to outlaw parochial schools in the state of Michigan. It was anti-immigrant, which is to say that it hated all those new people pouring into the city, and 30,000 people joined that movement in the city of Detroit, which tells you how deeply divided it was. But as deep a division as that was, it wasn't the key one. The key division in Detroit was the growing segregation of its neighborhoods. Now, I'm not saying that prior to the 1920s, Detroit was a bastion of racial justice. It was not. But it also, its neighborhoods were not deeply divided. They just weren't. There was a traditional black neighborhood. There were a number of small black neighborhoods, but there was one major one in the city of Detroit. It's called Black Bottom, and it ran right along the eastern edge of downtown. But it was a black neighborhood in the early 20th century, in the late 19th, early 20th century, the same way that there were Polish neighborhoods or Italian neighborhoods or Irish neighborhoods. And what that meant in the north, in the urban north in the late 19th and early 20th century, is about half the people who lived in that neighborhood were from that group, and the other half weren't. Now, if you got a neighborhood that's 50% Polish, feels really Polish. But in fact, about half the people who would live in those neighborhoods wouldn't be Polish. That was the same with Black Bottom. It's about half African American and half white. It was a poor neighborhood. If you were a well-to-do African American, like, I don't know, let's say a doctor, you didn't live in Black Bottom. You lived in white neighborhoods. And nobody cared. And down in Black Bottom, black people and white people lived side by side, and nobody cared. And then in the early 20s, that started to change. All of a sudden, more and more whites began to say, I don't want black people living next to me. They can live in Black Bottom, that could be their neighborhood, but they can't live in my neighborhood. This is not hard to explain. As that African American migration came up to Detroit, it was met by a rising tide of racism. It's that simple, it's not hard to figure out. So let me make it just a little harder. And here's the thing. Racism alone cannot segregate a city. It can't, for a very simple reason. Even in the 1920s, there were lots of white people who didn't care. Let me illustrate it maybe a different way. You made the serious mistake of shaking your head. So let's assume you and I are neighbors. You are a decent person. I actually don't know that. I'm just kind of, for case of argument, we'll assume. And I am not. I don't want a black person living next to me, and you could care less. All things being equal, I can't force my racism on you. I need help. And that's what happened in 1920s Detroit, as it did in every other major city. People like me got help. And I can tell you exactly when it happened, because they wrote it down. 1923, the Detroit Realty Board, the organization of realtors, wrote into their rule book that if an African American wanted to see a property in a white neighborhood, the realtor could not show it to him. Wasn't there in 1921, wasn't there in 22, it's there in 23. At almost exactly the same time, the major banks in the city said if an African American wanted to buy a house in a white neighborhood, they would not give them a mortgage. The big insurance companies, the white-owned insurance companies, said if they did buy the house in a white neighborhood, they wouldn't insure it. And in the big developments that were going on in Detroit, because it was a boom town, developers were building huge tracts of land. What they did, those developers did increasingly, was they put a clause in the deed of the houses they were building saying this property can never be sold to an African American and often to a Jewish American. In other words, what happened was that the forces of the real estate market took that rising tide of racism and they organized it, and they made it structural. And that's how you segregate a city. Now, when Dr. Sweet came to Detroit in 1921, he didn't run into any of this. He knew that his patients were going to be black, so he moved to Black Bottom and he rented out a room on a street that was mostly white, actually. And he rented out some space in the back of a pharmacy so he could open his practice, and he did really well. But the man was in his 20s. And to use a technical, historical, academic term, when you're in your 20s, stuff happens. He met a young woman named Gladys Mitchell. They fell in love. They got married. They had a baby, a little girl named Eva. They moved in with her parents. Let me repeat that last bit. They moved in with her parents. You know what that means, right? They wanted to move out. And so in 1925, they went house hunting, and in the spring of 25, they found that house. And that's where the terror started. Because, as I said at the start of this presentation, Dr. Sweet understood the risk of moving into an all-white neighborhood. He understood that was a dangerous thing to do. And so all through the summer of 1925, he made arrangements for the protection of himself and his family when they moved in. They were supposed to move in on August 1st of that year, but they moved it to September 8th, which was the day after Labor Day. They took their move-in day and put it on September 8th. Why? Why the day after Labor Day? What happened in Michigan on the day after Labor Day? Kids go to school. Why is that important? Because it means on move-in day, the teenagers are off the street. He asked for police protection for the first few nights, and the police said they'd come. But the police department was a major center of Ku Klux Klan activity in Detroit in 1925, and no one thought they could trust them. So he arranged his own defense. He arranged for his in-laws to take the baby, because you take chances with yourself, but you don't take chances with your baby. On move-in day, the baby would stay with his in-laws. He and Mrs. Sweet would move in, and they'd be accompanied by two of his brothers who lived in town. He came from a big family. They invited a bunch of their friends. Altogether, they assembled 11 people. I don't know why I'm holding up 5 fingers for 11 people, but I could do this, and I'm still not getting to 11, so it doesn't make any difference. 11 people altogether. Dr. Sweet, Mrs. Sweet, 2 of his brothers, a cousin, and a bunch of friends. They would all come into the house the first few nights to make sure there wouldn't be any trouble, they could have some protection. But 11 people sitting in a house, and it's a corner house, by the way. Street runs here, that's Charlevoix. Garland runs up this way. 11 people sitting in a corner house, that's not going to do anything for you. And so all through August of 1925, Dr. Sweet gathered together a huge cache of weapons, 10 rifles, pistols, shotguns, hundreds of rounds of ammunition, and on move-in day, September 8th, they put them in some big bags, and they took them up to that gorgeous Detroit front porch, and they went up the stairs, and up in the hallway, the upstairs hallway, there's one of those nice built-in linen closets. And so they put all the guns in there, and they waited for nightfall, and they waited for the mob to come. And it came. 7:30, 8 o'clock that night, just as it was starting to get dark, they looked out those windows, and the police were there, policemen out on the sidewalk, but beyond the policemen, hundreds of white people. And the men raced upstairs, and they grabbed the guns out of the linen closet, and they went to those upstairs windows. They had chairs at the upstairs windows, and they sat there, and they waited for the attack to start. Nothing happened. They sat there all through the evening. And I can't tell you what happened out on the street sometime around 11, 12, I don't know. I'm not sure. But I got a guess. My guess is that somebody out in the mob looked at his watch and said, oh man, I got to go to work in the morning. And the mob went home. But imagine yourself one of those people in that house. Imagine the adrenaline. Imagine the fear. Mrs. Sweet said later that she spent that entire night just wandering through the house because she was just too scared to sleep. And the next morning, everybody tried to act like everything was normal. Dr. Sweet went down to his practice down in Black Bottom. Mrs. Sweet, she went out furniture shopping because she had a brand new house and there was nothing in it. And then around 5 o'clock that evening, everyone started to come back. Mrs. Sweet back from shopping, Dr. Sweet back from his practice, the men from their day's work, and they all started to gather inside the house again, all 11 people. Dr. Sweet, he set up one of those folding card tables in the dining room. That's the dining room right there. And the men sat around the card table playing cards, take their minds off things. You know what Mrs. Sweet was doing, right? Cooking dinner. She was in the kitchen. She had 10 people in her house. She was cooking a ham back in the back. And then around 7:30 again, Dr. Sweet's little brother Henry, he got up from the card table and he looked out this window here in the living room. And the police were back. They were out on the sidewalk again. And so was the mob. Bigger this time. And Dr. Sweet and the men, they ran upstairs and they got the guns out again. And Dr. Sweet, he picked a pistol out of the linen cabinet and he thought he'd better check to make sure it was loaded. So he tried to check, and when he tried to check, he realized that his hand was shaking like this because he was so tired and he was so scared. And so he went into the front bedroom up there where the dormer is, and he lay down on the bed for a while to calm his nerves. Took his shoes off so he wouldn't mess up the comforter. And he lay there about 20 minutes, and then something happened out on the street, and the crowd started throwing stones at the house. And they hit on that sloping roof and on that gorgeous front porch. And one of them hit one of those windows up there in the dormer. And when it hit that and the sound of glass breaking went through the house, the men opened fire. 25, 30 shots maybe, no one ever counted them. And they hit 2 members of that mob. One was a young man who was boarding, he was renting a room right across the street, in the house right across the street from the suite. He was a plumber's apprentice. And he'd come home from his day's work, and he was up in the bathroom, cleaning himself up after a day's work, you know, getting the sweat off of you. And the landlady's little boy came running up and said, "They're throwing stones at the Negro's house, you gotta see this." And so he decided he had to see this, and he came running down the stairs to see what was happening. He came out on the porch, straight across the street from the suites, and he got shot right about there. The other man was a man by the name of Leon Briner. He lived about other end of the block. And if you ever decide you want to go by the Sweets house on Garland Avenue, you'll realize it's a really long block. And so he was sitting out on the porch with his wife, but he couldn't see anything at the other end of the block. It was too far away. And so what he did is he came down just to see what was going on. And he was standing on the lawn straight across from the Sweets house talking to the people on the porch. He had his back turned to the Sweets house. And he got shot once in the back. The bullet passed right through him. And he died right there on the lawn. And it was at that moment that the police raced into action. They went inside the Sweet house. They arrested all 11 people in the Sweet house. Dr. Sweet, Mrs. Sweet, both brothers, all the friends, the cousin, all of them, all 11. And within 2 days, they were all charged with first-degree murder. And that's where the story should have ended. And would have, except for one little bit of luck. Because when those charges were issued, those first-degree murder charges was issued, one of the New York City newspapers ran a tiny little story. It's 1 paragraph long, way in the back pages. Headline said, 11 Negroes arrested in Detroit. And I will guarantee you, no one in New York read that story except this man. He is one of the towering figures of American civil rights history. His name is James Weldon Johnson, and almost nobody knows his name. He also wrote a little song you may have heard of. You're just not my favorite audience members, the heck with it. It's called Lift Every Voice and Sing. At this point, he was the head of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the most important civil rights organization in America. And when he read that story, he said, you know what? When the Sweets go on trial, we'll defend them. The NAACP will defend them. And that was his stroke of luck. Well, okay, it was the first stroke of luck. Because in those days, not like today, but in those days, the NAACP didn't have its own lawyers. Legal Defense Fund didn't exist yet. And so when they took on a criminal case, they had to go hire a lawyer. And they decided, James Weldon Johnson decided, that he knew that when the Sweets went on trial, all the jurors were going to be white men. He knew that was going to happen. And so he decided he wanted to hire a white lawyer. So he set out to get one. Nobody would take this case. This was a loser of a case. Black people moved into white neighborhood, killed white guy in 1925 Detroit. No criminal lawyer wanted this case because it was going to ruin their careers. So he found a lawyer who wasn't worried about it. His name was Clarence Darrow. Oh, man, I love talking to people your age, nothing personal against younger people, but you use that line with a younger crowd, they're like, huh? Clarence Darrow had built a career defending people other people really didn't want as neighbors. He had started his career, as the famous part of his career, as a criminal defense lawyer, defending one of those groups that really is beloved by the American people, radical labor leaders. His first major client was a guy by the name of Eugene Victor Debs. Okay, now I'm going to switch over to them. So we got somebody to smile at Eugene Debs' name, then we're going to come over here. Eugene Debs was, of course, the head of the Socialist Party, the 5-time presidential candidate for the Socialist Party of the United States. He was also the head of the American Railway Union. ran for the presidency 5 times, as I said, as a Socialist Party candidate. Thank goodness it's 5. I can do this right correctly now. The 5th time, from his prison cell. Clarence Darrow defended another union leader who was really popular in the United States. He was the head of a little union called the Industrial Workers of the World, the most radical union of its age. He defended their one-eyed president, Big Bill Haywood, on a charge of murder. He defended 2 labor activists, the McNamara brothers, who were accused of bombing the Los Angeles Times building in 1912. Los Angeles Times was an infamous anti-union paper, and somebody blew up their building, an act of terrorism. And they charged these 2 union leaders for it. And Darrow went out to LA to defend them. That one actually didn't go well. McNamara brothers had blown up the LA Times building. 1924, Clarence Darrow defended 2 young men accused of the most heinous of crimes. Their names were Leopold and Loeb, and they had murdered a child to see if they could get away with it. In the summer of 1925, Clarence Darrow defended another young man accused of a heinous crime. His name was John Scopes, and he taught evolution in a high school classroom in Tennessee. Arguably the most famous criminal trial of the 20th century. The famous Scopes monkey trial. The Sweet case was his next case after the Scopes trial. In the autumn of 1925, Clarence Darrow came up to Detroit to defend the Sweets and their 9 friends and relatives on charges of first-degree murder in a Detroit courtroom. And I'm not going to tell you what happened. Because I wrote this book. And I want to retire someday. I'm not. I'll tell you 2 things. Clarence Darrow didn't know much law. He had gone to the University of Michigan Law School. Now, that joke never works here. I don't know why. Oh, my brother went to the University of Michigan Law School. He would so be pissed off that I said that. I think that's why I say it, to tell you the truth. He didn't like the law. He thought the law was a sham. What Clarence Darrow loved was words. And he did some cool things in the courtroom, and I'm not going to describe them to you. I'll describe one of them to you. He did have 12 white men in the jury box. And one of the things he set out to do in the course of that trial is he set out to make those 12 white men feel what it meant to be an African American in the Jim Crow South. Not think about, not contemplate, not consider, feel. To feel the fear of the mob. To taste the terror in the back of your throat. To smell the stench of burning flesh. And then he said to them, and that's what's coming north. And then he did one other thing. Clarence Darrow's favorite part of a trial was always his closing statements, closing statements to the jury, because he had the stage to himself. And if you ever read his autobiography, which he wrote in the 30s, and you can't trust a word of it, what he says is that of all the closings he ever made to a jury, his favorite, the best one he ever gave was to the Sweet case. So I want to read you that. It's 7 hours long. Ready? No, I would, really, but I'm supposed to be in Oscoda in a couple hours. Okay, so let me read you the closing of the closing. I do not believe in the law of hate. I may not be true to my ideals always, but I believe in the law of love, and I believe you can do nothing with hatred. I would like to see a time when man loves his fellow man and forgets his color or his creed. We will never be civilized until that time comes. I know the Negro race has a long road to go. I believe the life of the Negro has been a life full of tragedy, of injustice, of oppression. The law has made him equal, but man has not. I know there's a long road ahead of him before he can take the place which I believe he should take. I know that before him there is suffering, tribulation, and death among the blacks, and perhaps among the whites. I'm sorry. I would do what I can to avert it. I would advise patience. I would advise toleration. I would advise understanding. I would advise all those things which are necessary for men to live together. And that is all. And it's right there. It's right there that you can hear it. That what Clarence Darrow was doing in that courtroom in that moment is he was holding out this thin, frail promise of redemption. But the thing is, redemption didn't come. Because, of course, the Southern system of segregation, that system of Jim Crow that was being constructed at exactly the time that Ocean Sweet was a boy, that system of segregation is dead and gone. It has been destroyed by that incredibly important social movement that I showed you at the very start of this talk this afternoon. But the Northern system of segregation, the system of segregation that divides neighborhoods, divides towns, divides cities, black and white, separate and unequal, remains firmly in place. And of all major American cities, Detroit is among the most segregated. And it seems to me, in that, Clarence Darrow got it exactly right. That until that system of segregation is dead and gone, until that segregation has been destroyed, we are not a civilized people. Thank you for letting me come today, and I would love to hear any questions or comments anybody has.